Okay, so welcome everyone to our STAMPS webinar series. So this is the first hybrid event of our new STAMPS Research Center. And it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Gwendolyn Eadie as our first speaker. So Gwen exemplifies the STAMPS concept of close interactions between statisticians and physical scientists. Gwen is an assistant professor of Astrostatistics at the University of Toronto. She's jointly appointed between the Department of Statistical Sciences and the David A. Dunlap Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics. She's the founder and co-leader of University of Toronto's Astrostatistics research team, and she works on a range of projects that use hierarchical Bayes inference to study galaxies, globular star clusters, stars, and fast radio bursts. She's also the current chair of the Astrostatistic Interest Group of the American Statistical Association and the chair of the Working Group on Astroinformatics and Astrostatistics of the American Astronomical Society. And today she will talk about studying the universe with astrostatistics. So Gwen, please take it from here.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that really nice introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me to come speak in person. I feel very honored to be the first hybrid speaker. So yeah, thanks for everything. My visit has been really lovely so far. What? Get rid of this little box here. Okay, there we go. So today I'm going to talk about 3 different projects that my group is working on. There's many more, but I thought 3 was kind of the limit for one talk. And we're going to be looking all the way from stars up into galaxies. So the first part of my talk is about stellar flares and using these things called hidden Markov models to try and find stellar flares in time series data from the TESS spacecraft. So you've probably all heard of solar flares, right? Our sun is an active star. It has flares every so often. You may have seen the beautiful aurora that was very active last night. If it was clear enough and you're in a dark sky location. And those aurora actually caused from flares from the sun. So you get these bursts of radiation and material from the surface of the sun. It's related to magnetic activity. And the frequency of these flares is also related to the solar cycle. And so stellar flares, they're like solar flares, just on other stars. We call them stellar flares. And like solar flares, they're also related to magnetic activity. They're also known to be related to things like stellar age, the age of the stars, how fast they're rotating, and so on. So what I'm going to be talking about are stellar flares on a specific type of stars called M dwarfs. M dwarfs are actually the most common type of star in the Milky Way, but 70% of all stars in the Milky Way are M dwarfs. They're very low mass. So less massive than the sun, sometimes half the mass or less. They're burning hydrogen and helium, just like our sun is, but they have fully convective cores. So the material is spinning about them, and they're going to be burning hydrogen into helium for a very long time. So they have this very long lifetime, which means that they could be a place that could host exoplanets that have life. And so astronomers are very interested to find out how active these stars are, how much they flare, how often they flare, how energetic are those flares, because those could affect the exoplanets that live in the habitable zones around these stars and could therefore affect, the development of life on these systems. So the data that we're using is from the Transiting Exoplanet Survey satellite, and I'm just going to show a little bit of this video. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, just so you get a sense of how this spacecraft collects data. So if I can just move it here. So I believe TESS has 2 different cameras, and it looks at different sectors of the sky at once, and it's scanning the whole sky and all the way around. Okay, so you get lovely time series data from stars all over the sky. And I can't remember what year it was launched, but it had its first data release probably five years ago or so. So it's a really rich and interesting data set to play with. I'm gonna. There we go. So if we look at the time series data collected from stars observed from TESS, we can look at the brightness of the star over time. And here's a couple of stars from TESS. And you can see that the star's brightness actually changes over time in kind of some oscillatory pattern. But then there's also these little peaks. And these little peaks that we're seeing are most likely stellar flares from these stars. And you'll see there's gaps in the data as well, and that has to do with the TESS satellite and how it downloads data to Earth and so on. So we have gaps as well. And here's just a sense of what the variety of shapes and characteristics that these light curves, these time series data can have, and how stellar flares can show up in many of them. So there are some idealized flare templates for stellar flares. And these templates exist because people want to measure the energy of the flare. And if you look at sort of the area under the curve of the flares that happens, that gives you an estimate of how much total energy was released. So people try to fit these templates to the flares after they've found them. And then once they get the energy estimates of the energy, they'll do that for a bunch of stars. And then they want to look at the distribution of the energies of the flares and the numbers of flares and how those things relate to things like how fast the star is rotating. So in this plot, the rotational period of the stars is the color, and then you can see that we're looking at the cumulative number density of the energies of the flares. So the approaches to literature to actually find these flares, there's a few different approaches. The most traditional is called sigma clipping. And basically you fit some underlying trend, and then you say, okay, here's my trend that takes out the main quiet state of the star. And then anything that's 2 sigma or above, we're going to say that's a potential flare. And then you go back and look at the data and you fit your flare template, and you do that for all the flares. So it's kind of a painstaking process, and it's pretty iterative. But it's been pretty successful at finding flares. Some people have also tried things like convolutional neural networks or change point detection to try and find flares in these data sets. And like I said, you find these flares and then you fit a template. The challenges with this is that the end of the flares are kind of ill-defined, right? That depends on when you decide it's gone back to its quiet state. You can also get these compound flares, right? So the traditional flare template, if you have multiple flares happening right after another, that template might not fit so well. And the energy is also pretty difficult to measure, maybe because it's compound or you don't know exactly where it ends. And finally, there may be smaller flares that are lower energy that we don't pick out from the sigma clipping method, right? You do the sigma clipping, you might not see those fainter ones. So what we've been using is something called a hidden Markov model. And this work has really been led by a graduate student who's at MIT, Uni Shen, who wrote the original code, and then now a PhD student at named Arturo Escobar, who's in stats at U of T. And they've done all of the hard work on this. So I'm going to try and describe the model to you here. So we have some observed brightness over time, right, from the star. That's our data. And we say that data is generated through both the sort of quiet state of the star and then some flaring channel. And so for the sort of quiet quasi-periodic trend, we model that with a Gaussian process using this code called celerite by Dinform and Mackey. So that models that underlying quasi-periodic oscillations. And then we also define this flaring channel, the ZT there. And so this flaring channel is like a latent variable that says what state the star could be in. And we define 3 states. So it's a 3-state hidden Markov model. It could be in a quiet state, be a firing state, or in a decay state. And so altogether, that's the hidden Markov model. And there's you have some transition probability of going between these states. So sort of as a cartoon in the upper right here, I'm showing the transition matrix in words for what states are allowed to go from one to another. So we've made it forbidden for the star to go from a firing state to a quiet state, right? If a flare happens, it should decay before it goes back to the quiet state. We also, we don't allow it to go from quiet to decay, because that would be some sort of drop in the light curve, which doesn't make sense for flares. And then all the other ones allowed, and we estimate the probabilities of transitioning between these states. And if you're interested in what distributions we choose for each state, they're written there. And then we use a Bayesian approach, and we use STAN to fit this, and we split the time series data into chunks to make it computationally feasible. And then the Gaussian process of the celerity parameters and the HMM parameters are sampled simultaneously in the model. And then for each set of parameters that we get from our posterior distribution, you can do this thing called state decoding that gives you, it assigns the state to every point in the time series. And because we're doing this in a Bayesian way, for every point in the time series, you actually get a distribution of states. And so this is one way that we can view this posterior distribution. right? In the top, we're showing the proportion of the samples that are in any particular state. So the black is quiet, the orange or bright red is firing, and then the yellow is decaying. And so here you can see the whole course of the flare as it's been identified in the time series by the hidden Markov model. And what's nice about this, it has some advantages, is it automatically gives you some uncertainty estimation for detection of the flare because you have these posterior samples. You can take that forward and fold it into the uncertainty estimate of the energy of the flare energy. And we've also found that this method tends to pick up those lower energy flares got missed by the sigma clipping method. And the way we found that was by doing these injection tests. So we took an M-Dwarf Starkin test that has known sections that are very quiet. There's no known flares. And we injected flares into that data set and tried to recover them and looked at things like the sensitivity or the positive predicted value. And so at the top, you can see where we've injected the flares. That's the ground truth. And then our proposed HMM model is the second one, and you can see it's identified the flares, and you also have the nice trend. And then for comparison, the third one is the traditional sigma clipping method that you would pick out the flares, but then you have to go back into the template fitting and make sure they're actually flares and so on. So just to summarize the results from this, we found that our method is at least as good as sigma clipping, and in some cases it's better. So per observation, it has better sensitivity overall and better positive predictive value. The other nice thing about it that I think is maybe a more qualitative thing, maybe you could quantify it, but you can see that the trend we're picking out is much more regular, right? We think that that's really what the underlying star is doing. Whereas in sigma clipping, when you do that, the sort of smoothing trend can absorb some of the flares or some of those small flares. So just to summarize this project and future work, we've come up with this 3-state hidden Markov model. It's at least as good as sigma clipping, possibly better. It has some advantages to it in terms of the uncertainty quantification. The one disadvantage is it is computationally expensive. So now I have a PhD student in stats, Rodrigo Bradas Herrera, and he's speeding up the Gaussian process portion of this code to make it faster so we can apply to all of the test stars. And then another PhD student in astronomy is going to take this and apply it to a population of M-dwarfs to try and understand their flare energy distributions and so forth. And of course, we're looking forward, we might be able to do this with some of the Gaia time series data that will be released in a year or two. Okay, so that was the first project. The second project I'm going to talk about is studying the relationship between globular star clusters and their host galaxies. So here's some pictures of galaxies on the left and a globular cluster on the right. And almost every galaxy in the universe has a globular cluster population. Okay, our Milky Way has about 160 of them. Andromeda, I think, has on the order of 300, 400 or so. But some big questions are, and what we observe is that all large galaxies have globular clusters, but some smaller galaxies and dwarf galaxies don't. They might, but they not all of them do. And in between, there's sort of this transition. And we want to understand what it is that's causing some galaxies to not have globular clusters. The big questions are what I just said, and also what is a good empirical model for studying the distribution of galaxies with and without globular clusters, and what can this tell us about globular cluster evolution in the context of galaxy formation and evolution itself. So just to look at some actual data, here is data from the local group in nearby universe of globular clusters and their host galaxy stellar mass. So on the x-axis, I have log of the stellar mass of the host galaxy, and then on the vertical axis, we have different quantities. So at the top, it's a 1 or a 0, depending on whether or not the galaxy has a globular cluster population. So just a binary variable. The second one is the number of globular clusters. So you can see there's the group at the bottom that don't have any. And then as you go up in stellar mass, the number of globular clusters tends to increase almost linearly on this scale. The bottom is you can take it one step further and take the number of globular clusters, make some assumptions about the mass to light ratio of those globular clusters, and then estimate the mass in the globular cluster system for those galaxies. And you get a plot like this. And the bottom one is actually a very common thing for astronomers to do, is look at the mass in relation to the stellar mass of the galaxy or in relation to the dark matter mass of the galaxy. So I'm going to go through each of these and talk about some empirical statistical models that we've used to try to understand and quantify these better. Now, what's often done with the GC count data is people have fit Poisson regression. And we wanted to investigate this because this is just an assumption that's often made. We're like, oh, it's nature, it's counts, probably Poisson, right? Seems to make sense. So my PhD student, Sam Barrett, who's awesome and is on the job market for a postdoc and faculty position, right? She did an investigation of different count models in this paper. She had zeros count. And she looked at Poisson regression, negative binomial regression, negative binomial with some shape parameter, and then these things called their zero inflated counterparts to see which of these models best describes this count distribution. So here's one of the plots from her paper just showing the data. And just to review, a Poisson model, right, it says that the mean and the variance are equal to one another, right? So as you increase in stellar mass, those two things should stay. The mean should stay the same as the variance, although it can change as a function of stellar mass. And then for the negative binomial, now the variance is slightly different. You can almost think of this as an over-dispersed or under-dispersed Poisson regression model. And then you can also throw in a shape parameter which says, okay, this extra parameter in the negative binomial is now also some function of the covariates that you have. And so this is the form that we chose for that. And then the zero inflated versions of these models are sort of piecewise, right? And you have some proportion, some parameter phi naught that determines the proportion between the zero and the non-zero population. So she looked at all of these. The top row has the Poisson negative binomial with the shape parameter, and then the bottom are the zero inflated versions of those models. And then the gray regions are the 95% predictive intervals for each of those model fits. So the predictive intervals, the widest one, the faintest one, are the 95%. So what those kind of mean is that if this model was correctly describing the data, then 95% of the data points should fit within those 95% predictive intervals. And so doing this, and she also did some model comparison tests, what Sam found was that the negative binomial was the best description of these data. So you didn't really need this extra shape parameter, and actually the zero inflated models weren't really necessary for this. So the main takeaways was that the Poisson regression is not a good model for GC counts. And I didn't go into this, but you can see it here. You can see a bunch of the points once you get down to low counts don't fall into those 95% predictive intervals very well at all. And that's the model that people are assuming when they do simulations or when they fit to this kind of data. So we showed that the Poisson regression is not a good model for GC counts as predicted by stellar mass, that the negative binomial regression was better, and that the zero inflation possibly isn't needed, at least in the form that we had used. So the implications for this are that when people go to simulate globular cluster populations in other studies, which people do, they'll often just draw from a Poisson distribution. And we're saying you shouldn't do that. You should probably just use the negative binomial instead. And you go to our paper, you could use the parameter fit that we got, and you'll get a better, something a little bit more realistic. Okay, so the other two parts, so that was just the counts. Now I'm going to look at the binary response. So now, does a galaxy have globular cluster population or not? Right? It's a 1 or a 0. And you can just do a simple linear regression and get your parameters based on this. And then you have, the shaded regions are showing up. That's weird. Then you have your logistic regression curve, and that tells you the probability of a galaxy having a globular cluster population given its stellar mass. And that can be useful because maybe you're looking at a galaxy very far away in the universe. You can't resolve its globular clusters, but you can kind of estimate its stellar mass. Then you can go to this and say, what's the probability that this galaxy actually has globular clusters or not? The last part is the mass of globular clusters. So this is the one where you take those counts, you assume some sort of mass to light ratio, and then you estimate the total mass in the globular cluster population, and look at that as a function of stellar mass of the galaxy. And what people have been doing for a long time in this is basic linear regression. And so they'll do basic linear regression and completely ignore the zeros, which I think, there's a lot of zeros. So, maybe that's not the best thing. And it does describe, like, this linear relationship does describe the high mass galaxies quite well. Like, there's definitely a linear looking relationship there. But is there more we can learn from this data if we include the zeros? The other thing that is interesting about this linear regression and some results from simulations is that we shouldn't expect to see any globular clusters that are above that top dashed blue line, because in simulations, they've shown that a globular cluster is going to be at most 10% of the mass of the cloud in which it formed. So even if you have a really small galaxy and it formed one globular cluster, that globular cluster shouldn't be more than 10% of the mass of the whole galaxy. So, logistic regression or linear regression, right? They're both using the predictor covariate of stellar mass, but one uses a binary response and the other uses a continuous variable, that's the mass of globular clusters. And so which one should we choose? And we said, well, why not both? And this is where hurdle models come in. So hurdle models are another example of a generalized linear model. And they're used a lot in ecology, applied stats, biostats, but they haven't really made their way to astronomy too much, although there has been some work in it, notably by D'Souza et al. And Elliott and some others. The textbook by Hilby actually is particularly good and inspired a lot of this work. So in the log normal hurdle model, what you get is the expected value of the log of the mass of the globular cluster system, and that's determined by the thing on the right, which has kind of a logistic part and a linear part. And so when you fit this in the Bayesian framework, and we just used, there's a package in R, so you don't even have to code this up yourself. It's in the BRMS package, which you just scan, it's very quick. And we tested priors to see what priors would affect our analysis. But in the end, what you get is this result. So we have this curve that's connecting the zeros up to the linear relation. And just keep in mind that that curve is the mean value, right? Like whenever you're looking at any sort of regression, right, the line is the mean. It's not any particular data point. So what we observe is that if you have a galaxy that has a globular cluster population, you can then take this and look at predict its mass in globular clusters. Or if you see a galaxy with some stellar mass, but you can't tell if it has a globular cluster population, you can again use this curve and the logistic part to figure out the probability of it having or not. And you can see if you can see closely, there's actually two linear lines here. One is from the hurdle model and one's the original linear model. So it turned out it didn't matter that much, the linear model fit, it wasn't that affected by the zeros. But we also didn't include measurement uncertainties or selection effects and so on. And we think this is kind of a more holistic way of looking at all of the data at once. The other thing that this gives you is it tells you a little bit more about the transition region over which galaxies do and do not have globular clusters. And what we observe is that galaxies that are less than 10 to the 6 solar masses tend to not have globular cluster populations. And so what we suspect from those simulations that we saw is that if a galaxy had one globular cluster that was made out of a 10 to the 6 solar mass, then it would be about 10 to the 5 solar mass globular cluster. And simulations show us that a globular cluster that small is not going to survive over the long timescales. And so that globular cluster, under its potential or any sort of gravitational interactions, is going to slowly get stripped apart. So then maybe these smaller galaxies did have globular clusters when they formed, and maybe now they don't. So I think what's almost certainly true, we've learned it's important to include the zeros, and the initial globular cluster mass, the initial location of where it is, and all these physical things that are going on are important to whether or not a galaxy has globular clusters today. Okay, so Sam took this one step further and developed a hierarchical errors and variables Bayesian log normal hurdle model, or HERBL. And what this does is it's still the hurdle model, but now she's included measurement uncertainties in both the predictor and the response. She also incorporated a random effect to account for any extra randomness in the data. And instead of using the stellar mass, she actually uses more of a direct observable, which is the luminosity. So in this way, she's actually able to estimate the mass to light ratio of the galaxy itself. So the predictor is no longer the stellar mass of the galaxy, it's now the luminosity of the galaxy, which you think is, it takes in fewer assumptions. So this is the model in kind of graphical form. The data are the teal circles. The parameters are the pink circles. And then you also have some hyperparameters that are, or priors that are in the dashed circles there. And you don't have to fully understand the whole thing, but you can see we have one of the parameters is the mass to light ratio of the galaxy. Okay, so here's the result that she had. You can see that the credible regions around the fit are a little bit wider. And then she also made this really nice plot on the bottom that I think is very illustrated. So she took her hurdle model and she simulated data from the hurdle model to see how well it matched the real data. So it's sort of like a posterior predictive check. And so all the simulated points are the pink points, the real data are the dark blue, and you can see that they match up really well. So this model seems to be a good description of the data. It also kind of puts a little bit of rest to these two outliers that we have. So in the top left, you can see there's Ursa Major 2 is circled and IC 1613. Those are both really, they're both galaxies in the local group. And Ursa Major maybe has one small globular cluster near its center. And IC 1613 is very high mass, but doesn't appear to have any globular clusters. And so originally people thought maybe these are just outliers, but based on this fit that we have, it looks like maybe they're actually just from this distribution and we just happen to see one that's that extreme. So yeah, another way of saying that is that even larger galaxies might exist today that don't have globular clusters, and it might not be weird, it might just be that extreme end of the distribution. So overall, with GCs and their host galaxies, including zeros is important. I think there's a potential information about the formation and evolutionary history of the galaxy and the globular cluster. Some future work that we want to do is to take this hurdle model and expand it further out, because we've just looked in the local group where our data is very good. And we can say with certainty that that galaxy has this many globular clusters. Maybe there's a few behind it that we can't see, but other than that, our sample is complete. But once we go further out in the galaxy, you're going to start missing the fainter globular clusters, right? You're not going to be able to see them all. It's going to depend on your telescope. So there's all these selection effects that we want to take into account. The other thing we could do is try to incorporate both the counts and the population mass at once. So just like Sam went from using the stellar mass of the galaxy to the luminosity, what if we went from the counts, which is the original data, and included some more parameters for the population mass? Maybe that could help us as well. And finally, understanding globular cluster populations in the early universe. This would be like really exciting. JWST has some fantastic images of lens galaxies where you can see these little clumps. I think someone calls them jewels or something, and they look like the formation sites of the first globular clusters. So if we could somehow study those in this framework, that would be really cool. But I think that's maybe way off. Okay, awesome. Okay, it's 2 o'clock, so I'm okay on time. I'm on the third project. So this last one is again about globular clusters, but now in relationship to these other galaxies called ultra diffuse galaxies. And these are a few projects I've been working on with my PhD student, David Lee, and he's been focusing on hierarchical Bayesian spatial point process models to do this. So for those who might not know about ultra diffuse galaxies, what they are galaxies that can be as big as the Milky Way, as big as Andromeda, but they have very few stars, which is weird. They were only discovered, I want to say like the last 15 to 20 years maybe. And they've kind of thrown a curveball into astrophysics. They have very low surface brightness, which is one reason they hadn't been detected for a long time. The brightness per area is very low or very small. But what is interesting is they have globular cluster populations. So here's a really nice picture of one. So this is a large ultra diffuse galaxy, and so you can imagine, if this was the size of the Milky Way, you wouldn't be able to see through it, but we can see background galaxies through this galaxy. So that's really showing you how diffuse these are with stars. So how did these galaxies form? Why are they so big but have so few stars? How did their globular clusters form? Like they have globular clusters, so they had enough material to form those. And are the GC populations different from other galaxies? What can this tell us about formation and evolution in the early universe? And the other big question about ultra diffuse galaxies is some of them look like they're super dark matter dominated, and other ones look like they have hardly any dark matter. So that's also very, very confusing. Now, the challenges with studying these is they're difficult to find, right? Because they have very low surface brightness. You need something like the Dragonfly telescope or a space telescope to find them. Space telescopes, it's expensive to get time. They usually have like a small area to look at. Yeah, they're tricky to find. And there's also significant measurement uncertainty with measuring those GC populations, because these galaxies are far away from us. We might not be seeing all of them. It's not always certain that that point is a globular cluster or a background galaxy. There's some haziness there. And sometimes these UDGs are found in clusters of galaxies. So not only are there globular cluster populations around the galaxies in the cluster, but there's globular clusters kind of in between the galaxies. So you have this mixture of like different globular cluster populations. So this is where my PhD student, Dae Lee, or he prefers to be called David, came in and said, what if we can discover UDGs using only the globular clusters, right? So you have ground-based images where you can see the globular clusters, and so you have some point source catalog. We can't see the diffuse light, but if we can find those clusters of globular clusters, then we could say this one's probably an ultra diffuse galaxy. Go get Hubble time and confirm it. So his first paper was published in 2022, and the method he used to do this was a log Gaussian Cox process. So what this is this inhomogeneous Poisson process that has some intensity parameter lambda, but that lambda is a function of the position on the image. And then has another layer to it where this lambda of S is generated by this log Gaussian random field. And in this random field is where you can have some spatial correlation, right? That you can, has parameters that you can estimate to try and find these little clumps of globular clusters that may be part of an ultra diffuse galaxy. So just mathematically, if we want to write that out, we have this inhomogeneous Poisson process. And then that, that intensity or rate, the lambda of S, right? The log of that intensity has two parts to it. It has some fixed effect and some random effect, which I'm going to tell you about in a second. And then the random effect is governed by this Gaussian process that has some covariant structure to it with parameters that we can estimate. So I mentioned that these UDGs are often in galaxy clusters where you have globular clusters around the bright galaxies. You have globular clusters in the intergalactic medium, and then you also have globular clusters that are around ultra diffuse galaxies. And so what we did with this log Gaussian Cox process is he said, well, we can model the ones around regular galaxies because we know what kind of profile those follow, what kind of distribution they follow. But the other stuff is going to be the randomness that we estimate in the field. And so using a Bayesian approach in inLA, he then estimated the posterior distribution for all these parameters, and then finds the regions of the posterior where this randomness, this U of S, exceeds some threshold and says there's a clump here of globular clusters that's way above the threshold of what would be considered random. That could be a potential UDG. And so here are his results. He applied it to this catalog of from the Perseus cluster, which has no UDGs in it. And so on the top, this is the intensity field that's estimated. And you can see there's a bright galaxy, and the intensity field are the colors, and then the points are the actual data. The points are all the globular clusters. So the intensity field has correctly identified that there's an elliptical galaxy there with a globular cluster population. Okay, that's fine. And then the bottom two are sort of like the residuals of what's left over. So the bottom left is the random field. This is this U of S. You can see that. And then you can define some sort of threshold, and this allows you to detect the potential UDGs. So we tested this on this Perseus data set and was able to find all of the ultra diffuse galaxies that were already known, which was great. So these are the actual images. The red points that are circled, those are the globular clusters that he used to find them. And then he also found this one in the upper right that no one had found before. There's 4 little globular clusters and no diffuse light. So what do you do at this point? Like maybe it's random, maybe it's not. So you observe it with Hubble. So we applied for Hubble time twice actually. And the second time we got it, and the reviews on our proposal were like, this is kind of risky. And we're like, yeah, it is. It is risky, but if we saw diffuse light, that would be really cool. So we looked and we didn't see anything. So there was, you can see the actual Hubble image on the left with the 4 globular clusters. They look very clearly to be globular clusters, I think. The middle image, you can see them again. This is just, changing the way the image is rendered a little bit. And on the right, this is if you were to add some diffuse light to it. That's what you might expect. So the one on the right is not real, but you might be able to make out the little bit of diffuseness there. So we just wrote this up in a research note and said, we looked, we didn't see anything. And there's no diffuse emission detected. So maybe this is just a random alignment of globular clusters in the field. Could be, but based on the probabilities that we saw, this should be really, really unlikely. So it's kind of weird. Maybe these aren't actually GCs. They look like it, but maybe they're not. Maybe they're really far away, like bright elliptical galaxies or something. I think to do that, you'd have to get spectra for them. Or I like this possibility. Maybe this is the darkest ultra diffuse galaxy we've seen yet. Like maybe there are stars there and we just can't see them and it's just a bunch of dark matter or something. So I think the only way you really know, you have to get spectra and figure out, are these actually spatially near each other in our line of sight and so on. Okay, so the next step David took, so he's also finishing up this year and he's applying to faculty jobs and postdoc, and he's fantastic. So keep your eyes out for David. So the next thing he did was to include marks. So a marked Poisson process. So the marks can be additional information that you have about each point in your data set. So with these globular clusters, we don't just have the positions, the XY positions on the image, but we have to have the color and we have to have the brightness, right? So you can include those as marks in your Poisson process. And you could even include some physical theories if you wanted. And so I'm not going to go into the details. David is the expert on this. Please ask him if you want. But basically, he modeled the different galaxy populations that you could have in the images, and he included these colors of the GCs and so on. And then he did this exercise again where you can find the ultra diffuse galaxies. So again, he found all of the ultra diffuse galaxies that we did before. He refound that candidate dark galaxy 1 with this image, with this method. And he found another one. So he has a candidate dark galaxy 2. And these are two different images. I'm trying to think. Yeah, two different images where this cluster was detected. So there's again four globular clusters, but it's a different one than before. And they're seeing two different images. And just with some very preliminary analysis, it looks like maybe there's some diffuse light, but we don't know yet. We can't say for certain. So we're working on this. This is in prep. I'm working on that, but I'm excited about it. So what David found in these first two projects was really one of the limiting things about finding UDGs was the photometric uncertainties that you have, was that the globular clusters themselves might, like their identification might not be certain. And also their membership, like is the globular cluster part of this group of globular clusters or not? And so he tackled this by writing a whole new model that he's calling MathPop. And what this does is a novel statistical method to infer the globular cluster counts around UDGs and low surface brightness galaxies. So not only is he trying to find these UDGs, now he's trying to actually estimate the number of globular clusters that are there. And this takes into account all these uncertainties as well. So this was just posted to arXiv in September. It has been submitted to AppJ, and MathPop stands for Mark Dependently Thin Poisson Process. So as this thing has gotten more and more complicated, the acronym will get longer and longer. Okay, so in basic terms, this MathPop is jointly modeling the spatial distribution and the brightness distribution at the same time. He's using these marks, the brightnesses of the GCs. It is still using an inhomogeneous Poisson process, but now he's also introducing this thinning. And the thinning is what accounts for the selection effects. So maybe we don't see globular clusters that are too faint, but they're actually there. Or maybe there's the galaxies also too far away to be, maybe the GC is too far away from the galaxy to be part of it. Maybe it's part of the intergalactic medium or something. So the thin process takes these things into account. And then he also wrote the model to take in a probability of each globular cluster actually being a globular cluster. Because when you have these things so far away, sometimes you can't tell for certain. The advantages of this method over traditional ones is that you're modeling all these different sources at the same time, which he had in his other model too, but now he's including the measurement uncertainty, he's including the color information and the brightness, and he's incorporating a probabilistic catalog of these globular clusters. And a real advantage of this is that you don't get unphysical negative counts of globular clusters. The traditional methods that astronomers have been using to get globular cluster counts in images can actually result in negative counts sometimes, which doesn't really make any sense. So graphically, this is the model. You can see in the center, you have some observed data, and then you've got a model for the intergalactic medium globular clusters, a model for the globular clusters in ultra-diffuse galaxies, and the model for the globular clusters in the elliptical galaxies. And then there's hyperparameters and so on for all of those. So we did some simulation tests and injected globular clusters into the real images to see how well he could recover the numbers of globular clusters. And so he used Matplotlib to estimate this n, and then also use the standard method that people do to estimate n, and then look at the difference to see how well they do. And this is the plot that he has. So the blue line that's sort of linearly going up, that's what the standard method would give you as a function of the true number of globular clusters. So the black line would be if your model was perfect and could perfectly estimate the number of globular clusters. And the blue line is the standard method, and then his method are the red and the green line. One is just showing the mean and one is showing the mode. That's right. And it's clearly doing a lot better. So that's great. Okay, and then what he did is, I'm gonna walk this in slowly. When he simulated these globular clusters in the images, he had to assume some sort of brightness distribution for the globular clusters. And so the horizontal line here is the true mode that he used for the globular cluster brightness distribution. And then the regions here, this is the estimated mode of the GC brightness distribution from the simulation test when he runs Matplotlib. So you can see the more, as the true magnitude grows, right, the estimated one starts to approach the true one, right? So his method, the so the more globular clusters you have, and I think it's the more that you have, the closer it gets to the true mode. And then the real data are the points on here. So these are the estimated mode of the GC brightness distribution. So we did this for a different true values for the simulated data sets, assuming that the mode of the GC brightness distribution was 25.3, 25.8, or 26.3. So this is getting fainter and fainter. And what he found was there's two ultra diffuse galaxies that are consistently outside of this range. So these galaxies appear to have a peak in their globular cluster luminosity function that is brighter than would be expected. And this is important because astronomers have assumed for a long time that the brightness distribution of globular clusters doesn't depend on the galaxy itself. And so they call this the globular cluster luminosity function. And the thought is that because all globular clusters fall within this globular cluster brightness distribution, you can go and measure the brightness distribution of globular clusters in a galaxy far, far away, compare that to what it should be, and get a distance estimate to that galaxy. So people use the globular cluster luminosity distribution and the assumption that all distributions of globular cluster brightnesses are the same to get distance estimate. What he's finding here, there's these two ultra diffuse galaxies that appear to have globular cluster luminosity functions that are different. So that could be physically interesting. Is it that ultra diffuse galaxies are just inherently very different, or does this have implications that are more broad? So the takeaways here from Matplotlib is that you can properly account for all these uncertainties and selection effects and the GC identification. He seems to identify two ultra diffuse galaxies with brighter than average GC populations, which could have some impacts for distance estimates in astronomy. And also, we're on the verge of discovering the darkest galaxy to date, but I don't know for sure. We'll see. Hopefully, we can get more Hubble time and find out. So that's my talk about studying the universe with astrostatistics. And I'll just put a picture up of my Astrostats research team. I want to give thanks to Tony Herrera-Martin, who's a postdoc. He designed their logo. We just got the points there are the original Hubble data. So that's kind of fun, and the regression line. So I co-run it with Josh Spiegel, and here are graduate students and postdocs. We have a website now as well, and I just have to thank all of our funding agencies for making this possible. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.